Alright, so at this point in the course, we have a working front end, a working back end, and we've seen how to connect the two by making network requests with the Axios library. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at here is how to add some simple user authentication to our app using Firebase Authentication. Now, what this is ultimately going to allow us to do is replace this dummy user ID that we've been using, right, 12345, with a real user ID generated for us by Firebase. And this will also allow us to have multiple users' carts being tracked on our site. Alright, now normally adding user authentication to a site is actually pretty complicated. Because we have to learn how to do things like store users' passwords safely, make sure our authentication flow is secure, etc. But this can be made a lot easier by using an authentication provider, and for that we're going to be using Firebase Authentication. Now, Firebase, first of all, is a very user-friendly platform for adding things like databases, hosting, and of course user authentication, which is all that we're going to be using here. So basically what Firebase Authentication allows us to do is quickly set up a specific sign-in method. And we'll see how to do this in just a minute here, and from then on all we have to do is install Firebase Auth into our project. And it provides some very simple methods that we can use to log the user in, log the user out, and get user data. So we'll be seeing how to do all of that. But just know that we're using Firebase Auth because it saves us a lot of work setting up our project. Alright, so anyway, now that we know a little bit more about Firebase and why we're going to be using it, let's see how we can start to add it to our full stack project. The first thing that we're going to have to do in order to add Firebase Authentication to our project is set up a Firebase project and app in the Firebase console. So you're going to want to navigate to console.firebase.google.com, which is the current URL of the Firebase console. And what you're going to want to do is, of course, log in with your Gmail account or some sort of account like that, and you should see a screen that looks something like this. So what we're going to want to do here is click the Add Project button, and the first thing that's going to ask us is for a project name. So I'm just going to call this project Vue Site, something like that. It doesn't really matter too much. The only thing that we can't change later is the ID of the app, which is this down here. So make sure that that's to your liking. I'm just going to leave the default one that they suggested for me. And once we've entered in the name, we're going to click Continue. The next thing Firebase is going to ask us now is if we want to add Google Analytics to our project. Now in general, Google Analytics is a very helpful tool, but since we don't need it for this project, I'm just going to turn this Enable Google Analytics for this project switch off. And then we can click Create Project. And it might take a few seconds while it creates our project in the background. But once we see it spin and the message "Your new project is ready," we can click the Continue button, and that will take us to the dashboard for our new project. Alright. So the next thing that we're going to have to do is link up our Vue application to this project we just created. And in order to do that, you're going to want to click on this little web button underneath where it says Get Started by adding Firebase to your app. So let's click on that, and we're going to have to enter in a name for this new app. Now this is the specific application that we want to link it to, so I'm just going to call this Vue Frontend, and we can always change this later, by the way, so don't worry too much about that either. And then what we're going to do is click Register App, and you can leave this Firebase hosting thing off for now as well. Okay, so now that we've created this new app and added it to our project, what you're going to see is that Firebase will spit out all of this code that it wants us to copy and paste into our project. So you'll notice that the first one of these is telling us to install the Firebase package into our Vue project. And instead of just copying this command directly, what I'm going to recommend you do, because Firebase's API has a nasty habit of changing, what I'm going to recommend you do is actually install this package with a specific version. So what we're going to do here is we're going to stop our Vue app temporarily if you have it running. And by the way, make sure you're in the front end for this. You should see front end on the tab name over here on the right hand side. And what we're going to do is say npm install Firebase. And then we're going to say it with the current version that I'm going to be using for this project, and that's going to be 9.15.0, so if you add this will make sure that you have the exact same version of Firebase on your computer as I do here. It'll just make sure that everything works the same way. Cool, so now that we've installed Firebase, the next thing that we're going to do is go back to the Firebase console here and copy all of the code that it gave us. Now we're going to want to put this inside our main.js file. So let's open that up. And before we call this createapp.use at the top, we're going to paste all of that Firebase code. And I'm going to remove all of the comments here just to clean up a little bit because we don't need those. And one last thing that you're going to need to do as well in order to avoid getting a warning from Vue is remove this const app equals part right there because Vue doesn't like it when we have unused variables. So cool. Basically what's going on here is this Firebase config just contains all of the information our Vue app needs to connect to the Firebase project we created in the console here. So what we can do now that we've copied and pasted all of that code is we're going to click continue to console and that'll take us back to the console of our project. And the next thing that we're going to do is enable authentication for our project. Now, the way that this is going to work is you're going to want to click on authentication. And you can also access authentication, by the way, by going over here to the left-hand side. And under build you'll find authentication. You can click on that and that'll take you to the same place. So once you're there you're going to click on this get started button, and that will change the screen here and ask you to select your first sign-in method. Alright. Now for this project we're going to be using a very simple and intuitive form of user authentication called email link authentication. So what you're going to want to do, in case you didn't catch that, is click on email and password under native providers. And then you're going to click enable next to email link, and that will also enable email password authentication up at the top. So what you're going to want to do next is just click save. And we've enabled our first sign-in provider for our project. So what we're going to do next is make sure that the current domain that our front end and back end are running on is listed as a trusted domain for our Firebase project. And in order to do that, you just need to go to Settings, select Authorized Domains. And what you're going to want to do is click Add Domain, and then you can find the domain here by going back to your front end and just copying everything except for the final path, right? So for me, that's going to be everything after HTTPS up until /products. We're just going to copy that and now we can paste that inside the domain and click add, and that will tell our Firebase project that we should trust that domain. This just allows us to reroute the user back to that domain after the user has signed in. You'll see what that looks like shortly. So anyway, that's all the setup that we have to do for now in the Firebase console. The next thing that we're going to do is see how we can start rewriting the front end and back end of our full stack application to incorporate a new authentication flow. Alright, so now that we've set up a basic Firebase project for our app here, the next thing that we're going to do is start adding the email link authentication flow to our app. Now, here's how authentication in this app is going to work. And this is obviously just one possible way you could go about it, but for our purposes here, it's going to be the easiest. What we're going to do is we're only going to allow users to add an item to their cart if they're logged in. So what this means is that if a user isn't logged in, instead of this add to cart button, we're going to display a button that says sign in to add this item to your cart, something like that. And then, when the user clicks on that button, what we're going to do is we're going to get the user's email just using a simple prompt. Obviously, that's just one way we could do that as well. You could create a new Vue component to get the user's email as well. But we're going to use a prompt because it's straightforward. And then once the user enters their email, what's going to happen is Firebase is going to send what's referred to sometimes as a magic link to the user's email. Alright, so the user is going to see an email show up in their inbox with a link that they can click that will take them back to the app and log them in automatically. Alright, so again, this is called email link verification, and it's a really straightforward way to add authentication to a Vue app. So let's get started with that. What we're going to do is inside our Vue application, we're going to open up the product detail page. And for now, what we'll do is underneath the item is already in cart button, we're going to add another button here, and this button is going to have the class of sign in. Alright, just for styling purposes. And what this will say is it'll say sign in to add to cart. Okay? And, of course, we're going to want to hide this button when the user actually is logged in, as well as hide the add to cart or item is already in cart buttons when the user is not logged in, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So now that we have this sign in to add to cart button, what we're going to want to do is create a method that will get called when this button is clicked. So what we're going to do is say at click, and then we're going to link this to a method which we'll call signin. And then let's scroll down to our component definition. And what we're going to do here is underneath this add to cart method, we're going to add another method called signin. And the first thing we're going to do, as I said, is get the user's email, which we can do by saying const email equals prompt. Please enter your email to sign in. Okay? And basically, what this will do is once the user enters their email into that prompt, we're going to have access to that value in this variable. Alright, so we can now use that to tell Firebase to send an email to the user. So what this is going to look like is we're, first of all, going to have to import a few things from the Firebase Auth package. So let's say import. And the first thing we're going to want to import from Firebase is a function called getAuth, and then we'll also import a few more functions. The first one's going to be send sign in link to email. And the nice thing about Firebase Auth functions is that they're usually pretty descriptive, so this actually sends the initial email to the user with that magic link. And then after this, we're going to say is sign in with email link. And what this does is it checks to see if the URL indicates that the user has just opened up a link from their email. Alright, and then last but not least, we're going to say sign in with email link, and this is the function that actually does the signing in. So we'll see how all of those work. And we're going to import those from Firebase/auth. And oops, it looks like that auto-corrected. That should be sign in with email link, not is sign in with email link, because we've already imported is sign in with email link over here. Cool, so here's what we're going to do now. We're going to use some of those functions that we just imported. The first of which is going to be the getAuth. That just gives us a reference to the Firebase Auth object. And the next thing we're going to want to do is define something called action code settings. Okay. So this is just going to be a settings object, and it's basically going to tell Firebase Auth how to redirect the user. So here's what this is going to look like. It's going to have a URL property, and this is going to be the URL that we want to redirect the user back to after they log in. So that's actually going to be the same as what we currently have for our product detail page. So let's just copy that and paste it, and we're going to need to replace the product ID with the actual product ID URL parameters. So we'll just say this. $root.params.productID. Okay. And besides that, the only other thing we need to add to this object is a property called handleCodeInApp. And we're going to set that to true, right? That just tells Firebase that we want to handle the code, well, in the app, as the property name says. And now that we have those action code settings, we can actually send the email by saying send sign in link to email, and we're going to pass the auth object from above into there. We're going to pass the email that we got from the user, and we're also going to pass the action code settings that we just set up to that function. And that is how we're going to send an email to the user using Firebase Auth. Cool. So now that we're sending this authentication link to the user using Firebase's send sign in link to email function, the next thing that we're going to have to do is listen for this function to complete, right? We want to know that everything went well and that Firebase Auth was able to send that email. Alright, so what we're going to do is say .then, and actually, since this returns a promise, we can use async and await instead. So let's just add the async keyword onto our sign-in method and then we're going to say await send sign-in link to email. So we're going to wait for that to finish. And once it finishes, what we're going to want to do, there's two things. The first thing is we're going to display an alert, telling the user to check their email. And again, you could do this in any other number of ways. You could display some sort of heading that tells the user to check their email, but an alert for right now is just the most straightforward way to do this. So we'll say alert, and we'll say a login link was sent to the email you provided. Cool, so now that we've displayed that alert, the other thing we're going to want to do is store the user's email that they gave us for later so that we can use it to sign in when the user clicks the link. And don't worry too much if you don't understand the mechanics of this yet, you'll see what it looks like shortly. We're going to say window.localstorage.setItem, and we'll call that item something like email for sign-in, and we'll set the value there to email. Okay. So this is just storing it for later in the browser's local storage so that we can get the user's email when the user clicks that link, as I said so. Now that we've done that, right? That's all of the logic that we need to write for sending the initial email link to the user. So now, we need to write some code for handling when the user actually clicks that link. Now, what this is going to look like is down here in our components created method, we're going to need to add a little bit of logic. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is check to see whether the URL indicates that the user got to this page using an email link. So here's how we do that. We're just going to use another one of Firebase Auth's functions that we imported. Alright, we're going to say, well, first of all, we'll need to get the auth object again by saying const auth equals getAuth. And then after that, we're going to say, if is sign in with email link, and we're going to pass the auth object to it, as well as the current location of the window. So we're going to say window.location.ref. And that will tell us, as I said, if the user just clicked the email link and got back to our app in that way. Now, if that happened, what we're going to want to do is log the user in with another function that we imported, which is this sign in with email link function. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say sign in with email link. And for the arguments here, we're going to pass the auth object as well as the user's email, which we can get from local storage. So let's do that here. We're going to say const email equals window.localstorage.getItem. And we're going to get the item called email for sign-in. And once we've done that, we can pass the email to this sign-in with email link function. So we'll say email. And the last argument here is going to be the location of the window again, so window.location.ref. Cool. So that should correctly sign the user in, but what we're going to want to do is wait for that by saying await sign-in with email link. And after the user has signed in, we're going to want to display an alert by saying alert, and we'll tell the user that they were successfully signed in like so. And the last thing that we're going to want to do is remove the user's email from local storage by saying window.localstorage.remove item email for sign-in. Cool, so that should be all we need to do there. So now that we've written all of that logic, let's test this thing out. What you're going to want to do is open up your front end and back end. And first of all, make sure that both of those are running without any errors. Alright, so let's scroll down here on the front end. And oops. It looks like I have an error here just because I forgot a comma apparently. So let's go and find that. And there it is, I just put a semicolon where there should have been a comma. So let's save that and see if that fixed everything. And sure enough, the front end is running. And I also have my back end running, which you're going to want to make sure to have as well. So let's go back to our front end now, and what we're going to want to do is hit refresh. And we should see now that in addition to our add to cart button, there's this sign in to add to cart button. Kind of a mouthful there, but let's try clicking on this thing. And what we're going to want to do is enter in the email we want to log in with. So I'm going to enter mine in here. I'm going to say shaun.vue.test@gmail.com and click OK. And sure enough, we see an alert displayed saying a login link was sent to the email you provided. So let's open up our email now. And sure enough, we see the email shows up now. And as you can see, it says, we received a request to sign into project, blah blah, blah. That's the project we created in the Firebase console. And all we have to do now is click this sign into project thing. And actually, since I'm testing this using incognito mode just because I needed to use a different email account than what I was using for Firebase, I'm just going to copy this link and paste it in a new browser tab here. But you should be able to just click that link yourself. And sure enough, we'll see that it says, successfully signed in. And when we click OK, it will display everything like it did before. So our user is currently logged in. And the next thing we're going to want to do is see how we can actually tell when a user is logged in and change our user interface accordingly. So that's what we have coming up next.